So we're here, beginning our series on missions of the church, the history of Christian mission and missionary work, beginning with antiquity, and then we'll go to the Middle Ages, and then during the modern period, especially the Protestant modern period, that has been taken care of by another instructor. So here's a quick question. What do we normally use as the break point between antiquity and the Middle Ages? Does anyone know this? The fall of Rome. That's exactly the right answer. Now, historians, we always like to identify a year, like this is the year that the Catholics and the Orthodox separated. This is the year that the Protestant Reformation started. It's in history, it's almost never like that, okay? But they're guidelines. So what year is that? The fall of Rome. 476. Okay, 476. There's a barbarian guy named Odoacer. I think I'm trying to pronounce that as correctly as possible. We usually say Odoacer or Odoacer in English. And previously, what happened with the Roman Empire? It had two capital cities. It had Constantinople, or what is today a neighborhood of Istanbul, and it had Rome. And the main center had moved. The center of power and life and influence had moved from Rome over towards the east, but the Roman part was still the name that was given, the Roman Empire. After that period, even though the Roman Empire continues all the way until the 1400s, when finally Constantinople is taken by Mehmet II, we call that the Byzantine Empire, but that is indeed the continuation of the Roman Empire. They always thought of themselves as the Roman Empire. We call them the Byzantine Empire because Constantinople, the city, means the city of Constantine literally, was built on a place where there was a previous small fishing village named Byzantium. So 476, that's sort of a breaking point where we're going to begin the Middle Ages. And then when do the Middle Ages end? When do we usually look at the beginning of what we call modernity? This is a nice round number. It's a little bit after the discovery of the New World. It's a little bit after the Reconquista, a little bit before the Protestant Reformation really gets going, so 1500. Okay? These are just kind of guidelines, but just to help us to have a mental map. So 476 to 1500s. Obviously, the people during the Middle Ages did not think that they were living during the Middle Ages. This is a thing that modernity, with the Enlightenment and the Reformation, they knew about antiquity and the glory of Rome and Greece and all these things, and then they knew that they were in some kind of new world that was, there was all sorts of intellectual ferment going on. So they just called this, well, these are the Middle Ages. And historically, we've kind of looked down on the Middle Ages, but I think that really is an error. The Middle Ages really were, I want to argue, the most influential and important time in terms of the expansion of Christianity. I know people will maybe make a counter argument, but let me lay out my case today and the following day. So let's begin at the beginning of the Middle Ages, the end of antiquity, the beginning of the Middle Ages. We are living there during a time of de-globalization. Have you ever thought about how early Christianity could spread so quickly? It was a very interesting time. If the Christian religion or the Christian church had been born a century or 2 centuries earlier or later, it probably would not have had the same ability to expand with that quickness. And why is that? Well, it has to do with the Roman Empire. A lot of the things in church history don't have to do with anything churchy or spiritual or particularly religious. What are the qualities of the Roman Empire that make it possible for Christianity to go into this a lot? First of all, you have the Jewish diaspora. So Paul and other Jewish people who become followers of the sect of the Nazarene, or the Way, as it was called later on in the Christian church, they have an initial audience to go to. You also have the Pax Romana. Later or earlier, just zipping across and around the Mediterranean Sea was not possible. It was not easy. And because it was not safe. But during the Pax Romana, they called the Mediterranean Sea the Roman Lake, because the Romans controlled all the area around it. Obviously, the fringes of empire are a different story, but that central Mediterranean district was safe. You also had the Roman roads. All roads lead to Rome. We even have this saying in Arabic. And there are Roman roads in the Arab world. And it was true. It was actually true. There were always large arteries that would lead to and from Rome. Later on, that's not true. Later on, getting from one city to another city becomes much more difficult, much more dangerous. The roads decay. During the Middle Ages, the city of Rome, which had hundreds of thousands of people, basically becomes a large village. The population of the city of Rome gets down to 5,000 people. 5,000 people. I mean, that's well, for various economic and political reasons. So you have the Jewish diaspora, you have the Pax Romana, you have the Roman lake, you have the Roman transportation system, and you also have a lingua franca. Lingua franca is kind of ironic because it means the French language, but what's the lingua franca? It's the Koine Greek, right? You have this kind of trade Greek, not the great literary Greek of Homer and so on, but this kind of trade demotic Greek. And of course, you also have another piece of the puzzle, which is there courtesy of 70 Jewish translators in Alexandria, who did what? The Septuagint, yeah, great, the Septuagint. So you already have the Old Testament translated into the language of the educated people. So you have all of these little puzzle pieces that are right there. It's like stepping into a kitchen, and you've got all the ingredients you need, and all you need to do is toss it together. So this is the idea of the globalized world of the Roman Empire and the early patristic period. So what happens after Rome falls apart in 576, after Odoacer takes the city of Rome, and then they did what they normally do? The emperor in the east says, okay, you can become the Caesar, you can become the emperor in the west, no problem. And he says, no thank you, I want to just become the king of Rome. We're going to be a sovereign, independent kingdom. Okay? So this is going to lead to deglobalization. So we're first going to talk about the mission of St. Patrick. The mission of St. Patrick. Everyone thinks that they know a lot about St. Patrick, but let me tell you, he's a fascinating guy, and he is really one of the most successful missionaries of all time. He wasn't actually Irish, though he is the patron saint of Ireland. He was born into an aristocratic family, like many great saints later. He was raised in a Christian home, but was not particularly devout as a child. Quite different than another saint, St. Boniface, that we're going to look at later, who even from his childhood was a very devout and serious Christian. He was born around the year 385. Like with many of these figures, it's quite difficult to figure out precise dates. 385, and he dies around 461. Anyone want to guess what day he died on?
Oh,
March 17th. Yeah, that's right. The feast days are traditionally the day when the saint dies, not when they're born. It's an interest there. There's actually a whole theology behind that, which you can ask me about later if you want to know. So this young guy, he's aristocratic. We're not sure exactly where he's from. Different people will say, oh, he's from here, like where's shawarma from? Oh, Turkey, Arabia, like everyone where's hummus from? It's from the Jews, it's from the Muslims. Well, anyway, the point is everyone wants to claim Patrick, but he's English, Welsh, or maybe Scottish. He is kidnapped by Irish raiders when he's about 16 or 17 years old. So he is a young guy, and he is enslaved, and he becomes a shepherd. He becomes a shepherd. Now, what does that mean when you're a shepherd? What do you do when you're a shepherd?
Tend sheep.
Tend sheep, yeah, maybe other animals, but probably sheep. A sheep herd. You spend a lot of time alone, right? This is a profound thing. We see it in many biblical figures too, right? That this idea of spending time alone in nature somehow can lead to spiritual reflection and introspection. And that is indeed what happens with Patrick. At one point he has a dream telling him to leave Ireland, telling him to go to the coast. There will be a boat there. He obeys the dream and he is able to escape. But by then he has spent a lot of time in Ireland and he has gotten to know the language of the people, the customs of the people, and he is able to leave Ireland. By that time he's speaking Celtic very well. There were Celts in Spain, but this is before the Roman Empire. This is, of course, why we have a Spanish word cerveza, which is a Celtic word, instead of all the other cultures which use this word beer, which I believe is Germanic. So, again, my brain is full of useless information. But anyway, the Celts, they're there in Ireland, and he has learned the language very well. He gets the boat from Ireland to England, and by this time he is very serious and very devout and wanting to grow as a Christian. He goes to Auxerre in France, which is a famous monastic site, and he becomes a priest. So he is living a monastic life at a well-respected monastery, but guess what? He can't forget the Irish. He is discipled by an influential abbot named Saint Germain, and he can't forget the Irish. Now, back then, they didn't have the word missionary. Of course, we should all know that the word missionary is not actually in the Bible, right? What are people in the Bible called? The people who are sent out by the church to take the gospel, to take the Christian message to other peoples? Apostles, yeah. And then apostle and missionary, they mean exactly the same thing. One who is sent out. Just one is from Greek and one is from Latin. The word missionary does not exist at the time. The word mission exists, but it would be much more in a political sense of like, okay, you are on a mission to this nobleman to negotiate some sort of agreement with him. The word missionary as being specifically religious will not become quite like that until 18th, 19th century. It's quite a much later development. What did Christians back then in the early Middle Ages, late antiquity, who felt called that they were supposed to go from one place to another place, from one people to another people, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Christ, what did they call themselves? This is a biblical word. It's a biblical word that has very deep roots in the Old Testament, more so than in the New Testament, although it's in the New Testament as well. Pilgrims. Pilgrims. My heart is set on pilgrimage, right? And they would call themselves pilgrims for the sake of Christ, or pilgrims for the sake of the gospel. And so that's how they would talk about themselves. I'm going on a pilgrimage to the Irish people. I will be a pilgrim for the sake of Christ, right? Not a pilgrim for the sake of visiting some holy place. That was a thing that absolutely existed back then. Again, that has roots in the Old Testament. You make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem or one of the other holy places. But they would be a pilgrim for the sake of Christ, a pilgrim for the sake of the gospel. This is how Patrick and all of the saints during this lengthy period of many centuries would have thought about themselves. So he's in Auxerre. He becomes a priest. He is discipled by a well-known and well-respected abbot. Eventually, he visits the city of Rome, where Pope Saint Celestine I, what a great name, Celestine I, consecrates him as apostle to Ireland. The role of Rome is interesting because people will often go to Rome in order to kind of have their mission blessed. So they're not independent, but on the other hand, it's not Rome, the central church, that's actually taking the initiative to do all this stuff. I'm sure there's some kind of practical lesson there as far as denominations and working with denominations, but not relying on the denominations to do everything. We can figure that out later. Anyway, Pope Saint Celestine I consecrates him as apostle to Ireland. There's that biblical word, one who is sent out. And he returns to Ireland as what we would call a missionary, or as what they would have called a pilgrim for the sake of the gospel. Now there's a mystery here. We know historically that before the mission of St. Patrick, Ireland is mostly pagan. And we know that after the mission of St. Patrick, Ireland is mostly Christian. So the question is, how exactly did that happen? And that's where we have a big question mark. We know a couple of things about his spirituality and the culture in Ireland, but we don't know exactly how this enormous shift in the space of a couple of decades happens. We really are not sure. But he does spread the Christian faith among the pagans of Ireland. Let me say a word about the word pagans. There had always been during antiquity, and especially during the Middle Ages, a concern for the people in the villages and the towns. The idea was that the cities had been evangelized, but the villages and the towns, they might have churches, they might have clergy, but they had really not been evangelized. They were still holding on to elements of paganism. We see that here in Spain with a council that was held in Elvira, which I think is over by what would be today Granada or Cordoba maybe. And the bishops are there together, and they're having this problem, right? That the farmers will have the priest come to bless their fields at the time of planting, but then they'll also have the pagan priest come and bless the fields. They're like, no, you can have the Christian priest come and say a prayer and a blessing on your fields, but you can't also have the pagan priest do it. So this is like an issue, and there's a whole bunch of rules, and we have all these preserved to this day. And there was one bishop who I think was in what is now France or Francia back then, who writes a whole book on the errors of the rusticorum, the rustic people, the people who live outside the cities. And he's a bishop, so he's like the senior pastor over this entire area. He's got a bunch of other pastors under him, and he's got this idea that these people have all sorts of weird ideas and practices, and we need to fully finish evangelizing them. So where does the word pagan come from? We're so used to this word. It comes from the Latin paga, which means field. Who are the pagans? The pagans are the people who live out in the fields. This also comes across from the word villain. What's a villain? A villano. What does that mean, villano in Spanish? Someone from the villa. Yeah, you can't trust these people. They're not good Christians. They're not honest. They're not civilized. They're from the villas. They're from the towns. So anyway, I just wanted to say that about paganism and about, that there was an awareness during this period that the cities had been evangelized, but the evangelization in the towns and the fields was, let us say, incomplete. Okay, it had definitely started, but there was a lot left to do. So this is all part of the context of what's going on during this time. Ireland does have Christians at that time. However, they are few and far between, as far as we know. The main power in Ireland, as far as we know, when Patrick gets there, and Patrick is there, he takes a group of companions with him, he doesn't show up alone, of course, are the Druids. When we don't know a whole lot about the Druids, they're very interesting and fascinating. We only have one writing about the Druids that is written by an eyewitness. And who was that eyewitness? A very famous guy, Julius Caesar. He kind of writes some stuff about these Druids. And then there's other Roman historians who will write about the Druids. So what do we think we know about the Druids? Well, they were definitely into astrology. We have found a calendar that was from a Celtic area that had, these are good months to do certain things, or even good days, or this day, don't do this thing. So astrology was important for them. They were counselors for kings, and according to some of the writings that we have, they were actually more important than the kings. So this is a society where the religious rulers, the cultic rulers, really have a veto over the political rulers. We know that they made sacrifices. There's a debate about whether or not they made human sacrifices. I think the evidence leans that yes, when they took captives, prisoners of war, that sometimes they would in fact make human sacrifices. Although, again, we don't have any writings about Druids from the Druids themselves. We have Romans who probably are not incredibly sympathetic to the Druids, so some people say that that's just hearsay, and it was sort of a thing that people were saying to kind of portray them in a negative light. We don't have any evidence that they're linked to Stonehenge, alas. That idea is not invented until like the 17th or 18th century. In any case, the Druids are a shamanistic group. Julius Caesar does not call them priests, which is interesting. He calls them magic users, astrologers, counselors. It said that the young men would go out into the forest to receive some sort of instruction or initiation from them. This is what we know about the Druids, but apparently, given all of this, they would have had a firm hold over Irish society at this time. They would have been able to control everything from procreation to harvesting to marriage to travel to where you could and could not go. So it sounds like a very powerful group of people. and Patrick is going to confront them. Well, Patrick is going to do a couple of things. The first thing that he's going to do is he's going to try to find indigenous images and indigenous concepts to translate and to communicate the gospel. On the one hand, he's not a lone ranger. He has been in France. He's been instructed by a well-known abbot. He's gotten the blessing of Rome, but then he's gone back to the land of his captivity. This is incidentally how the Orthodox Church starts in Ethiopia. Historically, of course, we have the passage in Acts of the treasurer going back down to Ethiopia, but in terms of archaeology, we don't have any evidence that the Christianity in Ethiopia flourished after that. But it's a person who's a slave, a Christian slave. They're freed, and they feel a call to go back and to evangelize the people. So that's St. Frumentius in Ethiopia. This is around the same time, by the way. So I want to communicate kind of the spirituality of Patrick, so you can get an idea of who this person is and how he's going to interact with the Druids. Okay, this is a prayer. This is called the Breastplate of St. Patrick. Has anyone ever heard this before? This is the full version. A lot of people know the partial version. This is the full version. And this is a prayer. It is an invocation of protection. Okay, this is a prayer for protection. And as I read it to you, I want you to ask, how would pagan Irish people, under the sway of the powerful wizard class of the Druids, how would they have heard this? Okay, so let me read this. It's a little bit long. I arise today, so it's the morning prayer, right? You say this every morning to invoke the protection of God. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. I arise today through the strength of Christ's birth with his baptism, through the strength of his crucifixion with his burial, through the strength of his resurrection with his ascension, through the strength of his descent for the judgment of doom. I arise today through the strength of the love of cherubim, in the obedience of angels, in the service of archangels, in the hope of resurrection to meet with reward, in the prayers of patriarchs, in the predictions of prophets, in the preaching of apostles, in the faith of confessors, in the innocence of holy virgins, in the deeds of righteous men. I arise today through the strength of heaven, the light of the sun, the radiance of the moon, the splendor of fire, the speed of lightning, the swiftness of wind, the depth of the sea, the stability of the earth, the firmness of rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eye to look before me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to speak for me, God's hand to guard me, God's shield to protect me, God's host to save me from snares of devils, from temptations of vices, from everyone who shall wish me ill afar and near. I summon today all these powers between me and those evils, against every cruel and merciless power that may oppose my body and soul, against incantations of false prophets, against black laws of pagandom, against false laws of heretics, against craft of idolatry, against spells of witches and smiths and wizards, against every knowledge that corrupts man's body and soul. Christ, to shield me today, against poison, against burning, against drowning, against wounding, so that there may come to me an abundance of reward. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise. Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. So that's it. What is he praying for?
Protection.
From what?
Every other spiritual authority.
Mhm.
Proclaiming this.
So this is the part that makes people uncomfortable. People love this part, the Christ with me, Christ before me. Like you'll find memes of that on Instagram, like, yay, St. Patrick's Day. This is what St. Patrick's Day is really about. I'm like, well, what about this part here? Against incantations of false prophets, against black laws of pagandom, against false laws of heretics, against spells of witches and wizards. What do we learn about this guy? He takes spiritual warfare
Very
seriously.
Seriously.
Yeah.
And up to this point, he's probably encountered it.
Yeah, and again, this is a morning prayer. I arise. I'm getting up. So this is probably written by Patrick for himself and for his companions, so that they can use this every morning. This is a person who takes spiritual opposition very seriously.
You can also see the people probably lived in fear of all these different things. That just comes through with this prayer.
Yeah. And so we're going to see this a lot. We're going to see what we call power encounters, okay? Where you have a person representing God the Father of Jesus Christ, and you see some other power representing the black laws of pagandom, to use Patrick's phrase, and confronting them. We'll see this with St. Columban. We'll see this later with a great example from St. Boniface, and we see it here. The Druids say, no, that forest is haunted. That forest has evil spirits. Patrick says, well, I don't care. It's not because he doesn't believe the forest doesn't have evil spirits. What does he believe?
God's bigger.
That's it. Yeah, it's not this thing like, oh, those are just superstitions. That doesn't exist. No, that's not how Patrick is approaching it. He's like, yes, okay, maybe there are evil spirits in that forest, but I will be protected by God. So just a beautiful prayer, a prayer of protection, a prayer for purity, right, against temptation. And there's a real sense that he understands that what he's doing is much bigger than just himself, right? I love the prayers of the predictions of the prophets and the prayers of the apostles and the innocence of the holy virgins and like all these things. Like he is identifying himself with this great, big community, even though at the beginning of his mission it's him and a couple dozen guys. Like that's what he's got. Patrick and then his successors will establish Irish monasticism. If you want to know about how that saved civilization, the book to read is How the Irish Saved Civilization. That's the name of a book. Because during the time when much of continental Europe was really being overtaken by the barbarians, the Germanic peoples, some of my ancestors, and some of y'all's ancestors probably, for some of you. A lot of those old Roman and Greek manuscripts had been destroyed, but sometimes monks would show up fleeing from Europe to this little outpost of Ireland where they would be preserved and they would be copied carefully. So what's going on during this time of Patrick? Well, it is during his lifetime that Rome is going to be sacked by the Visigoths. That's in 410 when Alaric sacks Rome. Alaric will not become the Caesar or the emperor or proclaim independence like Odoacer will later on. But that is important. That's in 410 because that will become the occasion for the writing of maybe the most important book in Christianity after the Bible, which is Augustine's City of God. So Patrick and Augustine are contemporaries. No indication that they ever knew each other or even ever knew about each other, but they are contemporaries. And also Patrick wrote an autobiography. So if you guys ever want to read the autobiography of Patrick, you can go ahead and find that. Well, in the end, we've seen some elements of Patrick's spirituality. We could go into some of his ecclesiology, but really, a lot of this is sort of mysterious, like I said. Even though we can identify aspects of who he was and what he was like, what Ireland was like at the time, we don't exactly know what his missionary method was in terms of converting the Irish. But we do know that it worked. And I suspect that a lot of it comes from his faith in God, as being superior to and more powerful than the forces of paganism. So, do we have any questions or comments on Patrick?